oolichan is a fascinating story because one of the things we discovered was in our, educating ourselves about what was the traditional diet here, is that the staple food on the West Coast wasn't salmon. It was oolichan grease. That people consumed huge amounts of the fat rendered from this little fish, the oolichan fish, that's like a smelt. And back before all this environmental devastation, there were oolichan runs in every river from the Aleutians all the way down to the California. Oolichan fish that ran up the rivers in the springtime in massive, massive amounts. They literally changed the color of the rivers. And it was called the rescue fish because it was the first seafood that became available after the rivers broke up. And they would be pursued by all kinds of predators, sea mammals, predator fish, birds. I've been up in the north on rivers when the oolicans were running, and you have swarms of flocks of seagulls and eagles and egrets and other predator birds swarming over the river while the oolicans run up the river. And what's been happening for time immemorial is First Nations who are located on the coast, when the oolichan runs start, they had oolichan camps on the riverbanks, and they would move the whole village down into their oolichan camps. Each family had their own camp, and they would start catching the oolichan fish and then rendering the oil from the fish. It's a very oily fish. It's something like 40% of the fish is oil. And they would, it was a long, delicate process of fermenting the fish and then simmering it in large vats over long periods of time and gently cooling it, and then the oil would surface and draining the oil off. And in the old days, they would spend months doing this, and they would store it in these beautiful bent wood cedar boxes, which were watertight. And you see them now in the souvenir shops and things, but this was their original purpose, was to store the oolichan grease. And they would store it, they would bury it and store it, and it was, shelf life was a couple of years or more. And they traded it. Other populations that didn't have access to the coastal oolichan runs wanted the grease, and they would trek inland over trails through the mountains that were called oolichan trails, and that they would haul this grease. And there were encounters with early explorers who described whole villages trekking, packing these boxes of grease, and even the dogs had grease boxes on their backs, going inland to trade the grease. It was a highly sought after food. And the thing about the oolichan was, why? This is the discussion Finney and I had when I had introduced him to this. I took him up into the north on one of the oolichan rivers, and we met people, and he was fascinated by this. And the question that was really interesting to us was, in an environment where there are a lot of other sources of fat, animal fats, they hunted caribou and moose and deer and mountain goat, and they had sea mammals, which were very fatty, and other fatty fish. Why this one particular little fish? Why did they go to all that trouble? And we actually ended up publishing a paper. We got the oolichan grease analyzed in Doug Bebus's lab down in Minnesota. He does lipid science down there. And we published a paper. And one of the fascinating findings was that the fatty acid profile of the oolichan grease was very similar to the fatty acid profile of human adipose tissue. So think about that for a minute. Here's a population, and they're eating a diet where their primary energy source is fat. And I've over the years now come to believe that this is how we're meant to eat, that fat is meant to be our primary fuel. So think this through. If fat is your primary fuel and you store it for rainy days, as a fuel, would you store it in the most desirable fatty acid profile? Of course. You're going to store the fat the way you like it. So that when you're looking for fat in your environment, dietary fat, the one that most closely matches your preferred fatty acid profile is the one you're going to prefer. And somehow, you know, eons ago, these primitive people, not so primitive,
Yeah.
because they figured this out, that in all the sources in their environment, the fat in that one little fish is the ideal source of dietary fat. And they did it without mass spectrometers and things like that, you know. You know, this ancient dietary wisdom, you know, it's just, it's a wonderful story.